writing me. Can you hear?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read my paper. I apologize for that, but as an anthropologist, it's my way of communicating as well, so I'm writing. Click, click, click. This is the only thing I heard when I interviewed Stephen Hawking for the first time. No sound, no voice, no facial expressions, maybe a soupçon of a smile and a few imperceptible movements of his fingers caressing the commutator as he selected words on his computer. Today, the movement of his fingers have permanently vanished to be replaced by the muscles of his cheek to coordinate an infrared connection to his computer. For those who know him, he can communicate with his eyes, but for the rest of us, his sole means of communicating is his computer. 50 years ago, Stephen Hawking developed ALS, more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. The disease is characterized by the slow destruction of all the body's muscles, while the mind remains unaffected. Hawking has become a kind of a brain in a vat. He's universally known as one of the greatest cosmologists of our time and one of the most brilliant physicists since Einstein, reaching an iconic status as the smartest person in the world in shows such as The Simpsons, Star Trek, and The Big Bang Theory. In a way, my story could stop here. There is nothing really mysterious about what I have recounted. Hawking fits perfectly well with our conception of how science and its heroes, the Newtons, the Einsteins, and the Hawkings work. To do science and to be a genius, all one needs to have is a powerful, a beautiful mind. And indeed, because of his disability, Hawking seems to embody the mythical figure of a genius, capable of grasping the ultimate laws of the universe with nothing but the strength of his reasoning. In brief, since he can't move his body, everything must be in his mind, and indeed, what else would a theoretical physicist need? These pictures of him illustrates very well what is our representation of, again, how science works. Hawking is alone connected to the laws of the universe. Hawking is the embodiment of the myth of the moderns, of what makes us modern. To be able to think, we think that we don't need a body. We don't need to be situated. We don't need colleagues. We don't need institutions. We just need a good mind. As an anthropologist curious to understand not only other cultures, but also our own, that has granted the ultimate power and authority to science and its heroes, I began an in-depth ethnography study of the Hawking phenomenon. Hawking, in a word, became my tribe. I followed him as he worked, produced theories, resolved problems, gave talks, and participated in documentaries. I also, of course, interviewed all the people with whom he worked, the nurses, the personal assistants, the students, the colleagues, and the journalists. I soon discovered that Hawking's genius, far from being the product of his mind alone, was profoundly located, material, and collective in nature. In other words, in order to understand the functioning of this genius mind, I had to understand the work of delegation, multiplication, and redistribution of competencies to people and machines, without which he would not be able to act and to think. I refer here specifically to the mobilization of the competencies of his computer, those of his students, spread across very different research fields, which enable him to integrate diverse information and the different facets of a problem, and those of his secretary, who sorts and arranges data according to his interest and to what he can process. Following from this, I concluded, turning the problem upside down, that all scientists are in some sense disabled insofar as they are unable to think without being attached to a set of instruments, machines, and laboratories through which their intelligence is distributed. Hawking then is not different because he has a disability, but because of his disability, He allows us to see how all scientists work, that is, enables us to see collective and material practices normally hidden from view and without which scientists wouldn't be able to perform. Hawking's condition makes necessary the mechanization, by this I mean the hierarchization, standardization, and routinization of his human-machine-based environment. This network of competencies, composed of machines and human beings, computers, students, colleagues, secretaries, and administrators, that I call his extended body, allows a yes and or a no to become operational. A yes answer to the question, do you want to go to this conference, will allow him to travel from one end of the earth to the other without having done anything more than twitching an eyebrow. Indeed, it is this network that will do the work. Without the machine, he won't be able to write, read, and communicate unless you are familiar with him and can ask him questions to which he responds by a yes or a no with his eyes. The computers and programs extend the intellectual capabilities of Hawking and allow him to perform by endowing him with the capacity to write articles, go to conferences, and respond to questions, whether already prepared or not. His artificial voice offers a double inscription as an instrument of thought. Indeed, what is well conceived is well said. That is all the more the case for Hawking, who does not speak. At the same time, this voice effaces and makes us forget the role of the machine insofar as it speaks for, comes from, and marks the presence of a public persona, despite the fact that every sentence is written in advance, either by Hawking or by someone else. The secretary responds to the media, classifies and responds to his email, prepares his conferences. The students perform the calculations upon which his talk will be based. The graduate assistant is responsible for the mechanical part of the collective, the computer, the wheelchair, and the synthesizer. He's also responsible for the media. He responds to emails, phone calls, he updates the website, and when it is a question of giving a conference, he books the plane tickets, prepares the images and diagrams, ensures the transportation and coordination of the Hawking machine voice from one point to another, while also taking care of his accommodations, food, the journalist, etc. The nurses will take care of all Hawking's physical needs. In other words, you thought, and I thought, especially when I started this project, that I was studying a man, an individual, when what I was studying was a large and complex organization. In the same way that Ed Hutchins, the anthropologist of cognition, studied a cockpit or a ship, or the Goodwins, an airport, with the exception that he is an individual. Or to put it differently, I argue that the individual is a collective. Despite all this, one could say one more time that there is really nothing very specific about Hawking. Rather, his disability makes apparent the normally hidden practices of academics and scientists who shift the administrative aspects of their positions onto others. They complete, classify, attribute meaning, translate, and perform. Hawking's example helps us rethink the dichotomy between humans and machines. Humans, we are told, have subjectivity, a self, a consciousness, a rationality. Machines, on the other hand, are passive, neutral, and inert. However, Hawking's case demonstrates that the machine does much more than transcribes its thoughts. Rather, it makes him write or writes with him. It completes his sentences. It gives him the voice. It gives him the possibility of escaping questioners expecting a yes or a no. It disrupts, and it also makes it possible for people to identify with him. The voice here plays a role not opposed to writing, for the written precede is the spoken. The voice, too, is indispensable to the fabrication of his identity. Without it, he can't perform, and to a certain extent, the voice becomes his him, as for example when it performs without him in the office of his assistant. Thus, Hawking doesn't just tell us about scientists, managers, stars and politicians, but about all of us, insofar as the programs he uses are now used to one extent or another by just about everybody. We are through email, Facebook, Twitter, texting, increasingly reliant on writing. Stephen Hawking was using these technologies from their inception. Indeed, is entirely dependent on them, as we are all becoming. In the end, Hawking's example provides a window onto our current socio-technological and literary practices. This ability perhaps needs to be rethought. Thank you.
Okay, now you can ask questions for either one. Any question for Bernie? Other than my question, where are they?
Where are they? Yeah, pretty high. I have a question for Helene about.
Okay, go ahead.
About whether you think that his knowledge of things and his ideas are those also coming through the distributed network and how I mean I understand obviously the output, what he says, but what about what comes in and the formulation of his thoughts and the work patterns, and I wonder if you could talk about that.
I try to what?
Yeah.
I try, as I mentioned, I was really interested in a way deconstructing the myth around Stephen Hawking, which is really the idea that, again, everything is in his mind, but what I'm trying to show is a form of exemplification. In other words, we all think that to think we just need a mind. And so I try to reconstruct the network of competencies around him, especially when he thinks, actually, and try to understand how students are organized and distributed around him, what kind of subjects they are working on, how do they work with him, how do they relate their information, and how he processes all these ideas. And what was very interesting for me is, again, instead of thinking that everything is in his mind, to see that a lot is happening outside. In other words, what does it mean when a student, when he gives a problem to a student? The student is going to spend 6 months working on this problem. He's coming back, and he does the demonstration on the blackboard. And Hawking says, no. And he leaves, and the student is going to work for 6 more months, and he's coming back. So my question is, who does what? What does it mean to do something? At the end, on the paper, obviously, Stephen Hawking will be the main professor and the main author of this paper. But my point is to say that often people who are at the head of a laboratory like his functions exactly the same way.
You had mentioned that Stephen Hawking's presentations are pre-written.
Mm-hmm.
So when he presents on stage like this, I have a few related questions. Does he actually have a question and answer where people can ask him a unique question and he can provide a unique answer? And how long does that take for him to generate a unique answer and verbalize it through his electronic voice?
It takes a very long time. The first time I interviewed Hawking, I spent 5 hours with him and he responded to 4 questions. So it takes a very long time because what is interesting is when you look at what is inside the computer and the way the language is organized, you can see that a lot of things are already pre-prepared in a way. And so it could be a little faster sometimes. But most of the time, if he has to go from scratch or to write from scratch, it takes, again, a very long time. So what happens when he gives a talk, he can't do what I do, is just improvise and respond to your question. Everything must be written in advance. And so that, I mean, I think it's very interesting as well, what it produces, for example, when I look at how the media recycle what he says, again, often it's totally pre-prepared. Everything is in his computer, and you see the media recycling what he's saying over and over again. that's another dimension, I think, that participate in the construction of Hawking, with very stable qualities. Again, the same stories about Hawking and so on. But again, it works maybe in the same way for people who are extremely public. And I think that's another comparison I'm making as well.
Could you repeat? It works the same way for people who are what?
Public, of a public figure.
Question?
Do you think there's anything distinctive about the concealment of the social dimension and the collaborative dimension of Hawking's work to the turning Steve Jobs into the uniquely innovative hero, and then there's always kind of a qualification that, well, he didn't really invent this stuff, it's more of a designer and a bully and an inspirer and okay. And then or the mad genius artist, the falsification of Van Gogh, as someone who seemed to work, in his own mad world when he was a deeply collaborative, very proletarian, sympathetic figure connected to religious and artistic trends of his time. Artistic trends of his time.
I think there is. I don't think. Again, I think what I'm trying to show with this project is what I said at the beginning is, because of his disability, you are able to see what you normally don't see, in other words. In other words, when he works with his students, he has to delegate. He can't calculate. We forget that to calculate, you have to manipulate, you have to move your fingers. He can't move his fingers. So how does it work? So I was very interested in that. Again, he has to delegate, meaning his students are going to do the calculation. Okay. So, but